All right, kids, it's ready, hot stuff. And GT, Zust, thank you, man. And GT, slow down, eat up your mothers. Watching. And GT, he cooked dinner for the kids next door. Every single night for 3 months before. He found out their mother could end his planet with a hand gesture and a sentence. Nobody warned him. Nobody warned her either. That's the part that should scare you. Because the most powerful woman in known space spent 3 months watching a human feed her children, and she never once stopped him. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't want to. This is the story of Daniel Reyes, discharged cargo loader living in a refugee block on the edge of human space, who started cooking for 2 alien kids because they looked hungry, and ended up rewriting the terms of a war he didn't know existed. Stick with this one, because by the time it's over, you'll understand why the most powerful woman in known space chose silence over slaughter when she found out what was happening in apartment 412. You'll understand why the simple human habit of feeding strangers turned out to be the single most destabilizing weapon humanity has ever produced. And you'll understand why, when the war finally came, the first ship to break formation and fly to Earth's defense was flying under an alien flag. Daniel Reyes was 34 years old when the Tashlani Compact opened 3 systems to human resettlement, and he was one of 200,000 people who took the offer because the offer back home was nothing. Earth's economy had collapsed under the weight of the second contact recession. His cargo union had dissolved, and the resettlement contract paid for passage, housing, and a stipend that was barely enough to keep a person fed if that person didn't have a drinking problem. Daniel had a drinking problem for exactly 4 months after his wife left. And then he didn't, because he decided one morning that he was done being a problem for other people to deal with. He moved into Block 7 of the Cathari Station residential ring, a human-designated zone that the Tashlani had set aside the way you set aside a back room for storage. And he took a job recertifying cargo manifests for the docking authority, work that used about 11% of his brain and all of his patience. The apartment next to his, 412, had been empty for the first 2 weeks he lived there. Then one evening he heard scraping furniture and a sound he didn't recognize, a kind of low double-toned hum that he'd later learn was Tashlani children humming to each other in a frequency range humans can only half hear. He didn't think much of it. The compact didn't exactly publish a memo telling humans that Tashlani families were quietly being placed in the same residential blocks, mostly because the placement wasn't official, wasn't sanctioned, and wasn't something the Tashlani government wanted anyone to know about. Daniel just assumed he had new neighbors. He was right. He had no idea how new or how significant or how completely his decision to introduce himself with a plate of food was about to detonate every assumption both species had about the other. The Tashlani do not feed each other's children. It's not a cultural quirk, it's closer to a religious boundary. In Tashlani society, food preparation is an act of sovereignty, tied directly to caste, to clan, to the bloodline responsible for a child's survival. A Tashlani adult who fed a child outside their own clan without explicit ritual Permission could be charged with what roughly translates to interference with lineage, a crime serious enough that it carries exile in some provinces. So when Daniel knocked on the door of apartment 412, holding a pot of stew, because he'd heard a kid crying through the wall, and his instinct, his completely ordinary human instinct was, the kid sounds hungry, I should bring food. He wasn't just being neighborly. He was committing an act that translated into Tashlani legal and cultural terms was almost incomprehensibly intimate. He had no idea. He just saw two scared-looking kids and a mother who looked like she hadn't slept in a week. And he did what his own mother had done for half the building when he was a kid. In Houston, he fed people who needed feeding. The mother who opened the door that night was named Vezara Caldeson, and she did not tell Daniel her full name for almost 6 weeks, because her full name, properly given, included a string of titles that would have told him exactly who she was. She told him Vey, and let him assume the rest. What Danielson saw was a tired single mother with 2 kids, an 8-year-old named Thessaly and a 6-year-old named Oren, living in a unit that was technically beneath the station's minimum livability code, with food rations that were running thin. Because, and this is the part they didn't explain, for a long time, she was hiding the most powerful person in the Tashlani compact, the reigning queen regent of the Kelvash dynasty, ruler of 41 systems and commander of a fleet that could glass a planet in under 6 hours, was hiding in a human refugee block because 3 rival houses had just attempted a coup. Her husband was dead, and the only people in the galaxy she could be reasonably sure wouldn't recognize her on sight, wouldn't try to ransom her children, and wouldn't sell her location to the highest bidder were humans. Specifically, humans who'd been on the Compact's books for less than a year and had no idea what a Kelvash crest even looked like. So when Daniel showed up with Stu, Vesara Kaldasan, sovereign of 41 systems, looked at this stranger from a species her own people called loud, short-lived, and strange, and made a decision that would have horrified her entire court. She let him in. You're probably already asking the obvious question. If she was hiding from assassins, why let a stranger into her home at all? Tashlani royalty lived their entire lives inside a system so saturated with protocol, surveillance, and political calculation that an act of plain kindness, with 0 strings attached, was something Vesara had never actually experienced as an adult. Every gift she'd ever received came with an implied debt. Every kind word from a courtier was a move in a longer game. She had spent 26 years on a throne built on alliances that were really just slow-motion threats, and the one thing her culture had systematically removed from her life was the experience of someone helping her for no reason at all. Daniel didn't ask for anything. He didn't recognize her. He didn't even ask many questions, because Daniel Reyes had learned the hard way that people don't always want to explain themselves. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do is just put food on the table and let them eat in peace. He left the pot, told her to keep it, said something like, "Let me know if the kids need anything," and went back to his apartment to watch a rerun of a sports match that had happened 9 years ago. Because that's the kind of low-key, undramatic guy Daniel was. He had no idea he just done something that in Tashlani court terms was the rough equivalent of a foreign head of state walking unarmed into the Queen's private chambers and asking if she needed anything ironed. 2 nights later, he did it again. Because the kids were still there, still looked thin, and Daniel's brain didn't have a setting for ignore hungry children next door. This time, Vaisara watched him through the cracked door for almost a full minute before she let her children go get the plates, because she was running the calculation every Tashlani royal is trained to run from childhood. What does this man want? And the answer every single time kept coming back. Nothing. He wanted nothing. He cooked because his hands needed something to do in the evening, and because feeding people was to him not even a decision, just a reflex. The same reflex that makes a person hold a door or say bless you after a sneeze. It took Vaisara almost 3 weeks to accept that this wasn't a long con. It took her almost 3 months to understand that this man, this loud, short-lived, strange human, had become the only person in the galaxy she trusted without reservation. And she hadn't even told him her name. That trust got tested in 5 different ways over those 3 months, and each one chipped away at exactly how much danger Daniel was actually in, without him ever realizing it. The first test came the night Daniel found out the kids weren't human adjacent the way he thought. He'd assumed, reasonably, that Thessaly and Orin were some compact species close enough to human biology that regular food worked fine because they ate everything he made without complaint. What he didn't know was that Tashlani physiology runs on a metabolic process tuned to extract nutrients from a narrower band of proteins than humans use, and most human food, while not toxic to them, was borderline useless nutritionally. Basically, the equivalent of a kid living on flavored water for 2 months. Thessaly, the 8-year-old, finally said something in that blunt way kids have of cutting straight through an adult's blind spot. It tastes good, but I'm still hungry. After Daniel, who had spent 4 years loading cargo manifests and had picked up enough station trade Tashlani to get by, asked her what she usually ate at home. Back home, and Thessaly went quiet in a way that made Vaisara stick into the doorway fast. Daniel caught the tension immediately and didn't push. He just said, okay, tell me what your body needs and I'll figure out how to make it taste like something. That single sentence, according to the records that eventually surfaced after this story became public, is the line Vaisara replayed in her memory more than any other moment. Those 3 months. Not because it was profound, because it was the first time in her adult life that a more powerful party, and in food terms, in survival terms, Daniel held all the power in that exchange, chose to adapt to her instead of asking her to adapt to him. Daniel spent 2 weeks experimenting with protein ratios, using ingredients he could get from the station's human zone market, cross-referencing compact nutrition labels that were never designed for human readers, just to get Tashlani child nutrition right, using human-grade groceries. He never once mentioned it was extra work. He never asked Vay for money, though she tried to give him some twice, and he waved it off both times, telling her, "You'll get me back when you can, don't worry about it." A sentence that meant nothing to him, but meant something enormous to a woman whose entire life had been built on the principle that nothing is ever free. The second test is where things start getting genuinely dangerous. About 5 weeks into this routine, 3 independent contractors working for House Mordeal, one of the rival houses behind the coup attempt, traced a partial energy signature of the Cathari residential ring and started quietly working their way through the human-designated blocks, posing as compact housing inspectors. Daniel didn't know any of this was happening. What he did notice, because he's observant in a low-key, unbothered way, was that Vay started locking her door differently, that she asked him once almost casually whether he'd seen anyone official looking around the building, and that Oren, the 6-year-old, started flinching at loud knocks. Daniel didn't ask the big question. He just started walking the kids to and from the small human zone schoolroom himself every morning and every afternoon without being asked, because he'd noticed Vay looked exhausted and scared, and he figured one less thing to worry about might help. What Daniel didn't know was that his presence, a large, calm, visibly protective adult human walking to Teshlani, passing children through a human block twice a day, completely scrambled the bounty hunters' profile. Their intelligence said the Queen Regent was traveling alone with 2 children and minimal protection. Their intelligence did not account for an unaffiliated human civilian who had, without any contract, training, or awareness of the stakes, inserted himself into the role of a bodyguard simply because he liked the kids and didn't like seeing their mother scared. One of the contractors, getting impatient, approached Daniel directly outside the schoolroom, flashed a fake compact inspector badge, and asked him point-blank what his relationship was to the woman and children in Unit 412. Daniel, who had spent 4 years dealing with dock supervisors who loved nothing more than throwing fake authority around, looked at the badge for about 2 seconds, recognized the holographic seal was slightly the wrong shade of blue for an actual compact credential, because he'd processed thousands of real ones in his old job, and said flatly, "That seal's wrong. You're not compact." The contractor, caught completely off guard by a human cargo worker correctly identifying forged credential on site, hesitated just long enough for Daniel to step fully between him and the kids and say in the same flat tone, "I'm going to walk these 2 home now, and you're going to go find a real job." The contractor left, not because Daniel won a fight, there was no fight, but because a blown cover with witnesses is worse for a bounty hunter than walking away, and Daniel had just completely by accident, out of nothing but stubborn protectiveness and 4 years of dock floor instinct, defended the Queen Regent's children from an assassination reconnaissance run without ever knowing that's what it was. The third test changes the emotional center of the whole story. After the schoolroom incident, which Daniel mentioned to Vay in passing as some guy with a fake badge bothering kids, I ran him off. Vazara sat with that information for 2 full days, turning it over, because she now understood that her children's protector had no idea what he was protecting them from, and that not telling him was, in its own way, putting him at greater risk, because an uninformed offender makes uninformed mistakes. So she came to his apartment one night After the kids were asleep, sat at his small kitchen table while he made tea and got as far as saying, "Daniel, there are things about me you don't know, things that could put you in danger." Before she stopped, because the look on his face wasn't fear and it wasn't curiosity either. It was patience. He just nodded slowly and said, "Okay, you'll tell me when you're ready, or you won't, and either way I'm still walking the kids to school tomorrow." Vaisara has since described that moment in the limited interviews she's given since this all became public as the moment she understood that Daniel's protection of her family was never conditional on understanding the threat. He wasn't protecting the queen regent of the Kelvash dynasty. He didn't know that person existed. He was protecting Vey and her kids, full stop. And the size of the danger didn't change the size of his commitment, because to Daniel, that's not how commitment worked. You don't ramp your care up or down based on the stakes. You just show up. 2 nights later, Thessaly, completely unprompted, in the middle of eating a dish Daniel had finally cracked after weeks of trial and error, looked up and said, "You make food like you're trying to keep us, not like you're trying to fix us." Vaisara, by her own later account, had to leave the room. Tashlani court cuisine, the food she'd eaten her entire life as royalty, was meticulously engineered, optimized, perfect and utterly without warmth, prepared by staff who were performing a duty, not expressing anything. Daniel's cooking was clumsy by comparison, sometimes overseasoned, sometimes a little dry, completely inconsistent, and it was the first food either of her children had ever eaten that came from someone who simply wanted them fed and happy, with no political calculation attached at all. The fourth test is where the stakes go from personal danger to civilization-scale consequence. The day the real compact security finally found her, it wasn't the bounty hunters. It was her own loyalist forces, the ones still faithful to House Kelvesh, led by a hardened fleet commander named Tasik Vral, who had spent 4 months tearing through 3 systems looking for his queen. When Vral's team finally traced her to Kathari Station and breached the residential block properly with full tactical clearance, because they were the good guys in this particular fight, Daniel was in Vaisara's kitchen, finishing dinner prep when 6 armored Tashlani soldiers came through the door with weapons raised, because that's what a proper extraction looks like when you don't know yet whether the civilian in the room is a threat. For about 4 seconds, Daniel Ray's ex-cargo loader stood between 2 children and 6 rifles, not because he understood what was happening, but because his body had apparently decided a long time ago, somewhere below conscious thought, that when armed people burst into a room with kids in it, you put yourself in front of the kids. Vral, to his enormous credit, recognized what he was looking at almost instantly, and barked an order to stand down before anyone did anything that couldn't be undone, because even a battle-hardened commander could see that the man in the kitchen, apron with flour on his hands, wasn't an enemy combatant. He was just a person who'd reacted on instinct to protect children that weren't his. 20 minutes later, once weapons were down and Voral understood the situation, came one of the best exchanges in this entire story. Vorel, standing in a cramped human apartment kitchen, looked at Daniel and said, with what witnesses describe as genuine bewilderment, "You didn't know who she was." It wasn't a question. Daniel just shrugged and said, "She's Vey. The kids are Thessaly's and Orin. I know what I need to know." Vorel turned to Vaysera and asked in formal court Teshlani whether this human had been informed of her identity, her rank, or the political situation at any point during the past 3 months. Vaysera said no. Vorel, who had served the Kelvash dynasty for over 30 years and had seen every flavor of court flattery, manipulation, and calculated loyalty that existed, stood in silence for a long moment, and then said something that later became, in certain Tashlani military circles, something close to a proverb. He protected the queen for 3 months, without knowing she was worth protecting. Strategically, he protected her because she was hungry and scared, and that is worth more than every oath. My soldiers have sworn. That line is the hinge the rest of the story turns on. So hold on to it. The 5th and final test was what Vaysera did next. Because here's where this stops being a sweet story about a guy who cooks for his neighbors and becomes a story about how one small, consistent act of human decency rewired the political calculus of an entire alien civilization. Vaysera Keldessen had a choice in that kitchen. And GT clears throat. And GT, she could thank Daniel. Quietly relocate her children back into the heavily fortified royal court. Return to her throne and let this entire episode become a footnote. A strange and slightly embarrassing story about the 3 months the queen hid among humans. Plenty of advisors, once she was back in power, urged exactly that. Because the political optics of our queen was saved by an unranked human civilian who fed her children, were to a deeply hierarchic, status-obsessed court culture mortifying. Vaysera refused. Not loudly, not as a grand gesture, but with the same quiet, immovable resolve Daniel had shown her every night. For 3 months, she told her court in a now famous address that was eventually leaked and translated into 11 human languages, that the survival of House Kelvash and the safety of her children had been secured not by fleet commanders, not by spies, not by political maneuvering, but by a human who asked for nothing and gave everything anyway. And that any noble who considered that a source of shame had fundamentally misunderstood what nobility was supposed to mean in the first place. She didn't make Daniel a lord. He wouldn't have wanted that, and she knew it. What she did was quieter and, in the long run, far more consequential. She opened a formal, permanent, diplomatic channel specifically rooted in what she called, in her own words, the human custom of feeding strangers without condition. And she made it personally clear to every rival house and every foreign power watching that an attack on human territory would now be treated as an attack on House Kelvash directly, not because of treaty obligations, but because of a debt that, in her words, cannot be repaid, only honored. When the war finally came, and it did come 18 months later, when a coalition of rival houses decided that humanity's expanding settlements were a convenient excuse to challenge House Kelvash's authority directly, the opening move of that war was supposed to be a strike on 3 human Resettlement systems designed to bait House Kelvesh into either abandoning its human allies, which would shatter the new alliance and embarrass the Queen, or defending them at enormous cost. Vaisara didn't hesitate for even one tactical cycle. She personally authorized the deployment of the Third Royal Fleet to Earth's settled systems before the attacking coalition had even finished its opening maneuvers. And Fleet Commander Tessic Vral, the same officer who had stood in Daniel's kitchen with his rifle lowered 18 months earlier, requested and was granted personal command of that defense, reportedly telling his own staff, "We are not doing this for a treaty. We are doing this because a man fed the Queen's children when he had nothing to gain. And I intend to make sure that debt is the most expensive thing anyone in this war ever tries to collect." And Daniel still lives in Block 7. He still recertifies cargo manifests, though now he does it for a compact dock that treats him with a confused, careful respect he's never fully understood and has never asked about, because true to form. And GT clears throat. And GT, he's never been that interested in being thanked to. Thessaly is 16 now and reportedly tells anyone who listened that Daniel's cooking is still better than anything the royal kitchens have ever produced, which is, according to several court staff, the single most controversial opinion ever expressed by a member of House Kelvesh, and absolutely nobody has been able to talk her out of it. Oren, who's 14, apparently still calls Daniel once week through a compact subsidized line just to talk about nothing in particular, the way you'd call a parent. Because to Oren, that's exactly what Daniel is. And Vaisara Keldason, sovereign of 41 systems and the single most powerful person in known space, still flies to Cathari Station personally without an entourage whenever her schedule allows, specifically so she can sit at a small, slightly wobbly kitchen table and eat a meal made by a man who never once asked her what she was worth. So here's the takeaway, and it's the same one Vral arrived at, standing in that kitchen with his weapon lowered. Power doesn't actually buy loyalty, not the kind that survives contact with real danger. The thing that survives contact with real danger is the boring, unglamorous habit of showing up for people who can't immediately do anything for you, and doing it without keeping score. Daniel Reyes never set out to shift the balance of power across 41 star systems. He just didn't like seeing hungry kids next door, and it turns out that instinct multiplied across an entire species that does this constantly, without even thinking about it, is the single most underrated strategic asset humanity has ever brought into contact with another civilization. If you want more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who chain everything without ever meaning to, there's a whole playlist linked below. And if this is the first one you've watched, hit subscribe, because there are a lot more humans out there who have absolutely no idea what they're capable of, starting with nothing more than a pot of stew and a knock on the door.